Halo 3 ODST may not have been created by as large a development team at Bungie or with as big a budget as the trilogy which precedes it, but it still packs one hell of a punch regardless. Telling the fragmented tale of the Rookie and the rest of his squad following their botched drop into New Mombasa during the Covenant's invasion, it's an engaging side story featuring plenty of its own twists and turns. This video is a supercut of my work covering Halo 3 ODST, a level-by-level examination of its campaign, plus a few extra thoughts regarding New Mombasa's streets which can only be heard here. Now let's jump straight into things. I hope you enjoy it. Halo 3 ODST begins with a group of, you guessed it, ODSTs comprised of Buck, Dare, Dutch, Mickey, Romeo and the Rookie, preparing to assault a Covenant ship floating above New Mombasa. The squad begins their mission, but as they plummet towards their destination, they run into a couple of issues. First, their objective changes, and so Dare sets a new trajectory, and then the Covenant ship enters slipspace, emitting an EMP which prevents the drop pods from deploying their parachutes. After losing consciousness, the Rookie awakens 6 hours later alone on the empty city streets, and so begins the search for his missing comrades under cover of night. Continuing to look for any signs of life, well, human life at least, you'll eventually make it to the Tayari Plaza and the building housing a TV screen with Dare's recon helmet stuck in it.
You gonna tell us her name, Gunny?
Ms. Naval Intelligence. Our new boss. Oh, brother. So check your mouths, find your chairs, and get set for a combat drop.
There's no better place, I think, to touch on Bungie's use of New Mombasa and the various objects you find as a framing device than here, although I will make it very brief as it's technically not part of the mission itself, and I do plan to discuss it in more detail as part of a longer video looking at the game in its entirety. In short, it's an extremely effective way to reconcile Halo's usual mission-based approach with something a touch more open. It's the approach I'd hoped Halo Infinite would take, with you being ferried off to individual story missions set in their own locations, so that more traditional levels could be fit into the open world experience. Especially here at the start of ODST, the contrast between the film noir atmosphere of the more exploratory nighttime sections and the daytime action-orientated sequences works wonderfully. It helps the first of the campaign's flashbacks land with real impact. Tayari Plaza itself begins right around the time the Rookie was knocked out, as Buck crash lands alone in New Mombasa. This is followed by a conversation with Dare.
Did I do something wrong? Because the only thing I regret about you and me, not knowing you were a spook when we first met. I would have been a lot less charming.
That's what I missed most about you, Buck. Well, your mouth was always a little faster than your brain.
I've said it before and I'll say it again, I really like how Bungie handles the pair's relationship. The trilogy which precedes it is rightfully focused less on the smaller relationships between individual characters, other than of course between Master Chief and Cortana, and more on its overarching story. That was the correct decision, considering how much needed to play out across the three titles. Here there's much more of an interest in the interpersonal, and it came as no great surprise to me to see that trend continued into Reach as well, where we see it to an even greater extent amongst Noble Team. I've always considered ODST in story terms to be a testbed of sorts for Reach, with Bungie beginning to explore the impact of the war with the Covenant within a group dynamic as opposed to previous games being more about the individual. Buck and Dare's relationship is the focal point in that regard, with the characters around them definitely less built out than those in Reach, but nevertheless these early stages are as clear an indicator as any as to how Bungie wanted to shape their narratives moving forwards. Probably my favourite thing about Tayari Plaza is its aesthetic and atmosphere, which work particularly well at its outset. There's something so bleak but also beautiful about the blue tinge layered on top of the grey surroundings, with particle effects of the same colour filling the air around you. The beginning of the track More Than His Share, also known as Into the Breach, playing in the background now, is also a track I don't hear mentioned much when Halo's music is discussed, but it should be, as it's superb. It's not as in-your-face catchy as other popular songs in the game, but its female vocals pair perfectly with the initial firefights in the street, and it's one of the first tunes that springs to mind when I think about ODST. There's an interesting detail which can be found in one of the buildings just before you team up with a squad of Marines. The bodies of both brutes and elites can be found scattered across its upper level, hinting at Covenant infighting, a precursor perhaps to the Great Schism, which has yet to take place. There are one or two other places you can find similar too. It's definitely of some importance, as Buck even comments on it.
School zone. Please, slow down.
What the hell happened here?
Final notice. Bill past due.
I've always wondered whether the superintendent's dialogue, "Final notice, bill past due," has any meaning. An achievement is named after it, the one for beating the levels part-time, but if anyone thinks it has any connection to the scene you come across, do shout in the comments. I ask because there's clearly meaning in other places. For example, towards the end of Tayari Plaza, the superintendent mentions the lower levels, which is presumably a reference to where Dare went next, the underground data hive.
Attention, travelers. Lost items can be claimed on lower level.
It's definitely food for thought. When I ranked Halo 3 ODST's missions in a video you can watch by clicking the card on screen now, I put Tayari Plaza at the bottom of my list. For those of you who have already watched it, you may then quite rightly be asking the question, Ben, how could you begin this video by describing Tayari Plaza as a decent little mission when you think it's the weakest in the game? Well, I'm glad you possibly asked, allow me to explain. I actually don't think this mission is a bad one at all. In fact, as far as the worst levels in different Halo games go, this is by far one of the most enjoyable. At no point is there ever anything I can honestly point to as bad design, but equally, there's not much I'd single out as being amazing either. It's very middle of the road with fairly standard encounters, some decent level design with a surprising amount of verticality in places considering it's set on a city's streets, and some above average storytelling. That's all it really needed to be. After all, it's the game's first mission, it's there to help you get acquainted with things. Dare even gives you one or two handy hints as you progress.
Got a little jackal problem.
An overcharged plasma pistol shot will neutralize their shield. It should also take down a brute's armor.
Oh yeah? Where were you a minute ago?
Still trapped inside my pod.
My decision to place it at the bottom of my list then was less an indicator of its poor quality and more of ODST's campaign not featuring any real stinkers. I must also admit, Tayari Plaza's impact on me has lessened over time more than some other levels have. When I originally played it, I was really excited, as it felt much closer to the style of intense street fight against the Covenant in a human city I'd wanted than Halo 2's missions perhaps had, or closer to the E3 2003 trailer for Halo 2, which I continue to be obsessed with. However, since then we've had Exodus in Reach, which is the best example by far, and so nowadays Tayari Plaza, while entertaining enough, doesn't have the unique selling point it once did for me. The mission's final proper encounter is its best. Up until this point, everything has been fairly narrow, but here there is quite a bit more to think about. You've got brutes shooting at you from an upper level, jackals posted behind them, and enemies at ground level to contend with, all out for your blood in an arena much bigger than any encountered so far. Combined with the pair of hunters which arrive on the scene later on, it's a solid sequence that brings out the best of ODST's city combat in a more structured manner than that featured during the nighttime free roam sections. Arriving at Dare's drop pod, you'll find a few remaining grunts who aren't the sharpest knives in the drawer as they stand stationary firing at the empty pod. Once they've been dealt with, Buck meets his first engineer, beginning the setup for the larger story being told, links up with Romeo, and Tayari Plaza comes to an end.
What the heck was that? You ever seen one before? Hey, Romeo, you got your ears on? Oh, I get it. Permission to speak, smartass.
No, I don't know what it was, but it was gonna grease your ass good. Just like it did the captain.
Returning to New Mombasa, the rookie leaves the helmet and continues his search of the city. Eventually, he comes across a downed optics package, which marks the transition to teammate Dutch for his first flashback. Uplift Reserve begins with Dutch watching a pair of wombats fly overhead as he begins his journey.
Good hunting, boys. I'm keeping my boots on the ground.
Starting out equipped with a Spartan laser is a choice by Bungie I'm a big fan of. It's obviously a powerful weapon, but you're not just given it for fun. With there being so many Covenant out to get you, there's always the distinct possibility that they manage to destroy the vehicle you're travelling in, leaving you stranded on foot at a moment's notice. The Spartan laser then is something of an insurance policy. If you do happen to suddenly find yourself standing mere meters from a brute chopper or wraith, you'll still have something that can make light work of them to hand. It dramatically reduces the possibility of you finding yourself stuck without a vehicle and without a means of destroying enemy vehicles, which would be a very tricky scenario to tackle indeed. During the intro to this video, I waxed lyrically about the Warthog as a vehicle, and while I will always love them in all their wonderful forms, I do have a couple of complaints. I'm not going to moan at length about the AI's pathfinding, as I've done so plenty of times before, and we all know it's a bit dodgy. I do find one aspect of it a little strange though when it comes to Uplift Reserve in particular, and that is the way any allies driving vehicles you're not also in have a really hard time making their way from one area to the next. Building up a small convoy as you progress, if you manage to keep your allies alive, is rewarding when it works, but I often find it impossible to make it happen as they really don't seem to understand how to navigate their environment. This clip of me fighting off some banshees about sums it up. I fought through the area leading up to them alone as no marines opted to join me, and then a single Warthog randomly showed up out of the blue, a Warthog which then refused to get involved any further following its arrival. My second complaint is one I need not be so verbose about, and that is that the ODST Warthog is not my favourite in the series. Its handling is quite sluggish and it feels slower than in other games, so I tend to avoid getting behind the wheel of one as much as possible. Granted, it's never been the speediest of vehicles, and on this occasion it could just be my imagination, but in ODST specifically, its movement often feels glacial. Anyway, that's enough complaining. Let's now talk about a couple of auditory positives: Uplift Reserve's soundtrack and Dutch's dialogue. This is one of those levels where the soundtrack accompanying the action is perfectly suited. The tracks Ground War and Oscar Mike are percussion heavy and complement the weighty vehicle-based combat really well, and then during the mission's latter stages, the Menagerie, a track similar in tone but with a lot more going on, kicks in to keep things intense. Dutch is also a great character, and while he doesn't have a ton of lines during this mission that you won't hear in this video, he's consistently entertaining throughout ODST's campaign in general. His dialogue is along the same lines as Buck, quite quippy in nature, but I personally slightly prefer the way Dutch is written, with his humour being a little bit drier. Oh, and slightly off topic, but if you have a spare 20 minutes, make sure you go watch the episode of Halo Legends titled The Babysitter he stars in too, as it is excellent. Reaching the level's halfway point, you witness the fall of the new Mombasa space elevator as you cross a bridge leading to the next area.
Look! The elevator! Incoming!
What the hell just happened?
The subspace rupture! Must have weakened the support rings.
It's a fantastically choreographed moment that goes a long way towards showing just how bleak the reality is for humanity and those remaining in New Mombasa especially. Most of you, I'm sure, will already be aware of this, but you'll have actually seen the end result of the space elevator's collapse during Halo 3 mission Savo Highway. There, various parts of the structure lay strewn across the savannah, and it's a neat touch that you're later able to witness how they ended up there. Speaking of Savo Highway, it's perhaps a tad reductive to describe Uplift Reserve as its sister mission of sorts, but I don't think that description is too far off the mark. Savo Highway is a much longer, more involved experience without question. However, the two do share many similarities. There's the aforementioned space elevator, their aesthetic is near identical, and the way they're structured isn't altogether different either. Uplift Reserve is a series of narrow paths connecting looping open areas designed for vehicular combat against wraiths, ghosts and choppers, while Savo Highway is, you guessed it, almost exactly the same, except it's got a bit more more to it, and there are no ghosts. Each arena is expressly designed for vehicles, and they all have a wonderful circular design which makes it easy for you to constantly rotate around the battlefield, as opposed to having to push forward directly into the Covenant as Halo Combat Evolved and 2 tended to encourage. It's a style Bungie really began to utilise more from Halo 3 onwards, and it's on full display during ODST as well. I always enjoy Uplift Reserve's final couple of encounters too. The first is a really entertaining battle around a landing pad which feels like a callback to a certain set piece in Halo Combat Evolved. In Truth and Reconciliation, before entering the Covenant ship, you had to hold off waves of enemies who travelled down to a landing pad to greet you, while in ODST you take part in a more straightforward firefight with baddies who are already waiting for you. Admittedly, the similarities are only skin deep, so you might consider it a tenuous comparison at best, but it's what always springs to mind whenever I play through this section. There's also a crazed Marine who can be found not too far away.
Semantics! This whole place is one big cage!
Listen, Marine, you're wounded. You gotta try and relax.
Except we're the zebras, get it? All fenced in and ready for the slaughter!
And the Covenant?
They're the lions! Rawr!
Crazed Marines are something of a Halo tradition by this point, with one featured in 343 Guilty Spark.
Stay back! Stay back! You're not turning me into one of those things! I'll blow your brains out! Get away from me!
Floodgate in Halo 3 also had one.
The LT, the sergeant, they were all infected!
And later, another would appear in Reach during New Alexandria.
Seriously, we're fighting aliens now? Innies were bad enough, now we got freaking aliens? Not me, man. I'm out. Out!
Your last tangle with the Covenant is much the same as the last, with more ground troops and wraiths to be dealt with, after which it's time for you to make your escape. To conclude proceedings, you're left with no choice but to launch yourself off a makeshift ramp, and the scene which follows will change to match the vehicle you end the level driving. If you used a Warthog or a chopper, then that's what you'll see, and likewise if you're piloting a Ghost.
Lord, I didn't train to be a pilot. Tell me I don't have any more flying to do today. So, was that a yes or a no?
With Halo 3 ODST's first two missions done and dusted, you're able to choose the order you tackle the next four in, which makes now the perfect time to chat about New Mombasa. Most will remember their time with the city predominantly because of its atmosphere, and in that regard, Bungie's work fits the game's underdog story perfectly. I suppose it could be argued that the trilogy which precedes ODST is itself an underdog story on a grander scale. On paper, both the Covenant and later the Flood should have triumphed over humanity, but you are at least playing as Master Chief, which means there's always a glimmer of hope. Think about the name of the character you play as here, the Rookie, and the situation he finds himself in at the start of the campaign. He is not a super soldier, nor is he particularly battle-hardened, with only 5 years of service under his belt. He is inexperienced, he is alone, and he is completely outnumbered by an extraordinarily powerful enemy. Those circumstances go hand in hand with the darkness enveloping empty streets, the exaggerated lighting, brutalist architecture, and moody jazz score, which all combine to create a mood unlike any other in the series. With Master Chief, the big question was, will he be able to save the world? With the Rookie, it's, will he manage to survive the night? Before ODST's release, the idea of there being a Halo tale which could be described as a futuristic neo-noir detective story would have sounded a tad crazy, but that's exactly what the Rookie's side of the game is. The objects left behind by team members are the main driver for you moving around the map, leading you on a trail across the city until you reach the end of Kikowani Station and venture underground. I've always absolutely loved being able to see the aftermath of flashbacks while playing as the Rookie, with ONI Alpha Site burning in the distance being my favourite of them all. The Superintendent AI responsible for managing the city helps guide you to each objective, and he is the best part of ODST's semi-open world, along with the game's atmosphere and aesthetic. He will point you in the right direction using different parts of the city's infrastructure, and will do the same to guide you to vehicles, weapon caches, and audio logs which tell the tale of Sadie and Disha. More on her when we get to Data Hive. It is such a clever way of giving New Mombasa some life outside of combat, even if you might begin to get sick of him if you decide to try and collect all 30 of Sadie's recordings. You don't have to follow his instructions the whole time though, and can move through some of the campaign's missions in whatever order you see fit. I like the idea of being able to take on a set of levels in any order in principle, although in practice it doesn't work that well. Tayari Plaza, Uplift Reserve and Kizingo Boulevard being interchangeable would make a lot of sense, as each introduces you to a member of the squad and easily functions as a standalone affair. Playing Kizingo Boulevard, ONI Alpha Site, NMPD HQ and Kikowani Station in the wrong order does nothing more than confuse for no discernible reason. It's great you're given some agency, and piecing together clues in the wrong order does make you feel like more of a detective without doubt, but I'd never recommend anyone actually experience them out of order during their first playthrough especially. Everything I've spoken about so far is awesome, but in a way, New Mombasa is also the most disappointing part of ODST for me. There's some really interesting stuff to find in New Mombasa. For example, this area where it looks like elites and brutes have had a squabble and killed each other off, or this scene of brutes equipping explosives to an engineer.
Hold the creature still! Place the charge before I lose my grip.
But they're few and far between, and a lot of the time the streets feel far more lifeless than I'd have liked them to be. I understand the battle for the city is pretty much over by the time the Rookie enters the fray, but you'd think there'd still be a few things happening. I'd have loved the world to have had a little more dynamism to it, some extra story beats delivered via NPCs present in the open world, a few more scripted events or set pieces you may or may not encounter depending on how thoroughly you explore, or perhaps even a reaction by the Covenant if you continually kill their squads in the form of better equipped groups patrolling. In fairness, with ODST, you always have to keep in mind that resources likely dictated a lot of decisions surrounding how the game was designed. Honestly, a Halo ODST 2 remains one of my dream sequels to this day, as the format has so much potential, and there's a huge amount of room for improvement even with the first being as good as it is. As mentioned, the next 4 missions, Kizingo Boulevard, ONI Alpha Site, NMPD HQ and Kikowani Station, can be played in any order depending on where you choose to head next. To avoid any confusion, I'll be working through them in chronological order, beginning with Kizingo Boulevard, which is triggered when the Rookie finds a destroyed turret. Kizingo Boulevard unfolds 90 minutes after the drop into New Mombasa. Similar to the Rookie's search a little later on, ODST Mickey explores the city's streets looking for his squad mates, and soon enough finds himself right in the thick of things.
Hey, where's the fight at?
Take a guess, genius!
Son of a gun!
You might have heard that famous phrase, give a man a rocket launcher and he can destroy a wraith, give him a scorpion tank and he can kill wraiths for a lifetime, or at least I'm fairly certain that's how it goes. Bungie adheres to both sides of that philosophy. You start equipped with a rocket launcher carrying only 2 shots, so that you're able to turn around and remove the one which appears behind you in an instant. I'd wager many will make a beeline for the Scorpion and worry about the Wraith after, but starting with an explosive loadout means you're covered either way. If you save the rockets though, they might just come in handy later down the line too. Using the Scorpion is the most obvious way of getting things in order, but you can also hop on the side of a tank as well, although I wouldn't recommend it. Despite it being nigh on impossible to last more than a few seconds, even on lower difficulties due to you becoming a sitting duck, it's a novel idea in principle. It's an option which is quite clearly meant to make you feel like an ODST, to really put you in Mickey's shoes, but there's absolutely zero incentive to give it much of a go because of how quickly you're usually taken out, having no choice but to ride along across an area or two containing weaker, less aggressive enemies before being given your own Scorpion could have been a lot of fun. Whether you hop in the tank straight away and begin blasting, clear the area on foot, or emerge victorious using a combination of both, you'll eventually need to continue on through the city streets.
Good work, Trooper. Covenant's been rolling us back block by block. Every Marine in the city is heading for a rally point near the Naval Intelligence Building. You ought to come with us.
Sure, as long as I get to drive the tank.
The next stretch through to meeting Dutch and going it on foot again is terrific. There are 3 reasons why I love it so much. Firstly, because it's absolute bedlam, but controlled, intentional bedlam. There are 3 larger areas you'll need to clear, with each presenting a different challenge. Ground troops and a few turrets in a small space comprise the first course on this menu of mayhem. A decent enough challenge, but nothing insurmountable. You mostly just need half-decent aim. Next, there's a greater number of turrets and ghosts to deal with in a larger area, which sounds tougher, but wide open space means good movement can lead to the firefight ending swiftly. The last area is the best of both worlds. A smaller space opens up into a more expansive one, which means figuring out the best angle of approach is essential. It's essential because there are enemies all over the place, foot soldiers and wraiths on the ground, and banshees and phantoms in the air. Taking up the right positions will minimise damage taken, but you need to be able to prioritise targets as well, so as to not get overwhelmed. Across all 3, plenty of allies are regularly thrown into the mix too, giving it the gritty, street-fighting feeling I'd imagine Bungie was going for. The second reason I love this section is because it offers something unique. It's not the first Scorpion section set in a city or its outskirts. That honour goes to the bridge sequence at the start of Halo 2's Metropolis, but it is the longest and most varied of its kind. When you think about the trilogy's previous tank sections, my bet is your mind first conjures up images of Assault on the Control Room and its snowy surroundings, Delta Halo and lush green hills, the sand dunes of the Ark, or the Covenant's tundra. All of them happened in vast, mostly natural areas on a variety of Forerunner structures. Kizingo Boulevard is not depicting a hero's struggle under epic circumstances, but rather, as mentioned, brutal urban combat, and this is a tank section which reflects that. There's nothing else like it anywhere else in the series. A Scorpion or 2 extra are also provided at intervals, so you can swap your ride out for an undamaged model if needs be, but there's very little reason to use anything else during this section. You can, however, if you want. It's not something I'd recommend to first-timers. As mentioned, encounters are heavily balanced on the assumption you'll be tackling them in a tank, but it presents a good challenge if you fancy trying something different. Also, a quick tangent here, this is exactly the kind of section I think should have been included at the end of Exodus in Halo Reach. You spend the majority of that level working your way through New Alexandria's heights before arriving back on solid ground, and at that point a tank sequence like this one would have been the perfect fit. Instead, there is an uninspiring drive between anti-aircraft guns. I don't mind taking down the guns, it makes total sense for Noble 6 to have to do that after the fateful Hornet ride which precedes that part, but working your way through the city streets in a tank to get the job done I think would have fit a lot better tonally and aesthetically. The third reason why I love this section is that as mesmerising as the action on screen can be, it wouldn't be anything without the music accompanying it. The way the track Traffic Jam is used throughout Kizingo Boulevard is tremendous. It starts out slow and plodding, the auditory equivalent of the vehicle you're in. It then kicks into gear during the level's midpoint as events really get out of hand, after which it pauses briefly before returning in more frantic fashion for the on-foot encounter at the mission's end. Composers Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore's work across the Halo trilogy, with tracks mutating and evolving from game to game, is outstanding, and I love seeing, or rather hearing, similar in ODST and later Reach, but contained within a single track. Speaking of the final on-foot section, as depressing as it may be, you've no choice but to leave your tank as you fend off Covenant and a Wraith during the closing set piece.
Those Covenant dropped in behind us. They must know this is our rally point.
Terrific.
Come on, we got ammo and weapons on the high ground. Move it, move it.
I've not got a whole lot to say about this one, except that I always find it surprisingly tricky. Covenant come at you from every which way, so you need to be nimble and keep on your toes to avoid getting flanked. There's lots of verticality and angles of approach which both you and your enemy can take advantage of, so being aware of your surroundings and using them appropriately to fight off incoming hordes is of the utmost importance. If you don't properly manage the crowds, you can very quickly find yourself in quite a lot of trouble, especially when playing on higher difficulties where the Covenant can cut you down at a moment's notice. Being forced to take down a single wraith at the back of the arena also serves as a nice reminder that as an ODST, you are still much more vulnerable than the Spartan you'll have got used to playing as in the past. Indeed, even during this level, wraiths might begin to seem like less of a threat as you shred them using a tank, so here you're taken down a peg or two. Firing off a charged plasma pistol shot and charging straight for it is the more high-octane way of dealing with the problem, but you can also use the rocket launcher you begun the level with, or pick up a new one hidden nearby, if you'd rather keep yourself out of harm's way. With the surrounding area at last cleared of the Wraith and any Covenant stragglers, Mickey and Dutch have a few moments to catch up as Kizingo Boulevard reaches its end, although as it turns out, their next mission is right in front of them.
You heard from Gunny?
No. Romeo neither.
Well, guess it's just you and me.
My vote, hold up, wait for backup. Thank God! Does one of you know how to use explosives?
Your vote just got overruled.
Oh.
The rookie next hunts down a remote detonator as Dutch and Mickey's story continues a little more than 30 minutes after Kizingo Boulevard ends. ONI Site Alpha begins with a demolition mission.
Hurry up!
Look, you want to do this? Be my guest. But this ain't a job you want to rush.
That do it?
Signal's good! Arm the other detonators and pull back to me!
And let's be honest, we all ignored Mickey and put Dutch's Spartan laser to immediate use.
Dutch, arm the other charges!
What about those wraiths?
Forget about them, we got explosives to set!
I love the contrast between the two characters, with Mickey the explosives expert focused on getting the job done, while Dutch simply wants to blow everything up. Bungie must have presumed you would want to use the Spartan laser straight away too, as they send in a couple of Banshees which are positioned perfectly for you to shoot out the sky using the big green gun. This opening sets the tone for the level as a whole, fighting through Tayari Plaza, using vehicles to cut a path through Uplift Reserve and exploding everything in sight using a tank across Kizingo Boulevard. All of Halo 3 ODST's previous outings had been about pushing towards your enemy, about breaking through their defences, whereas here, for arguably the first time, you're on the back foot. It undoubtedly makes it one of the game's most exciting set pieces. Being thrown straight into a dire situation really raises the stakes early on, with the immense Covenant presence serving to highlight the site's importance. Despite being given orders to head up a guard tower at the end of the bridge and detonate the explosives, you don't have to. There's a cannon nearby you can hop on to cause a little extra destruction, which I always gleefully take advantage of, but the bridge does eventually need to be taken out. You can hop off the cannon at any point, climb the tower and do it yourself, or you can ignore it entirely, which means eventually Dutch or a nearby NMPD officer will do the job for you. I suppose events do need to proceed at some point, regardless of how much fun you're having.
Ah, man, Covenant landing on the other side of the wall.
Bim bam and a brain pan.
ONI Alpha Site is the most relentlessly paced level in ODST, which works excellently alongside that idea of constantly retreating mentioned earlier. It does, however, mean a lot of its sections are blink and you'll miss it bursts of action. The bridge demolition earlier and the turret holdout, elevator ride and rooftop battle later, all of them last no more than a couple of minutes before Bungie hurries you along. This battle right outside the site's main building is the meatiest chunk of uninterrupted gameplay, and it's the best part of the mission. Your first task is to clear the area ahead of you, a relatively tricky proposition given the presence of 2 hunters along with the usual assortment of ground troops. Then you need to head up to the building's entrance as even more baddies are ferried in to ruin your day. You are given plenty of tools to bite back at least, with turrets galore at your disposal and sniper rifles dotted around so you're able to keep your distance. It's a beautifully designed arena to fight through, with a 3-lane structure most commonly seen in online shooter maps. Here it's a setup which works just as well for a single soldier shootout shootout, as all of your enemies come from one direction, which allows you to dance back and forth between the left, right and middle sets of stairs as needs be. I've no idea whether Bungie designed the environment for the campaign first and foremost and then ported it across to ODST's multiplayer firefight mode or vice versa, but either way, it's testament to how considered its layout is that it works so well across both. ONI Alpha Site also has a surprising amount of dialogue considering its length, with Dutch, Mickey, Marines and NMPD officers all chiming in at very regular intervals. It goes a long way towards heightening the feeling of plans being made on the fly as everyone tries to make the best of a particularly bad situation. Honestly, I had to stop myself from including about 30 clips from throughout the level in this video, there's that much quality chatter. Reaching the main building, it turns out a plan for what to do next is already in place.
Hurry up, man! Check those charges!
Wait, what? More explosives?
Yeah, what gives? I thought we were supposed to protect this building.
I have orders to deny enemy access to all classified data housed in this facility. You don't like it, jump your butts back into orbit.
Only thing I don't like is that our butts are currently inside this facility.
With the site housing a lot of extremely sensitive information, preventing the Covenant from getting inside its main building and accessing the data within is of the utmost importance. At this stage of the campaign, you probably won't realise just how vital stopping them actually is though. It's only later revealed that both the data core of the Superintendent AI, which manages New Mombasa's infrastructure, and part of the Forerunner's Ark seen in Halo 3 are both housed directly below the site. Later, during Data Hive, Dare actually mentions the site's destruction, not realising that it was members of her own team who were partly responsible.
Some idiots blew the building at the top of the shaft. Woke the whole Hive.
Back to events at hand, your next objective is to set up in the middle of the main hall and fend off any enemies who make it inside. This is one of those sequences which I think works better on lower difficulties. In the footage on screen I'm playing on normal and I'm able to safely sit using the turret, raining down hell indiscriminately on anything and anyone which dares to enter through one of two doors. It's brainless entertainment, which sounds like a criticism, but believe me, it's not. Grunts holding plasma grenades, ready to sacrifice themselves, run straight at you, no doubt sent in to soften you up. Jackals and brutes then follow closely behind, and cutting them all down amidst the explosions the grunts leave in their wake is immensely satisfying. On harder difficulties, the turret is essentially useless, and you'll need to resort to more conventional means lest you get swamped by onrushing enemies, and it's nowhere near as much fun as taking the easier route. Choosing the less taxing option also makes the set piece flow a lot better. First, you remain stationary, covering the two doors, and then after you can rip the turret away from its mount and go gung-ho as more baddies drop in from behind. Once it looks like the Covenant's assault is over, at least for the time being, you hop in an elevator and ride up to the building's roof. Along the way, you'll have to swat a gaggle of drones. It's nothing much to write home about, although the drone's plasma pistol fire set against the dimly lit elevator makes it a visually unique encounter. During the skirmish, Dutch also asks where they've all come from.
Where the heck did these buggers come from?
Underground tunnels are filled with the damn things.
With your allies' answer being a subtle tease towards what's to come, as you later discover their nest during Data Hive while exploring the tunnels below. Your final fight occurs on the rooftop itself as one last group of Covenant is ferried in to stop you escaping. The brutes bouncing around the roof with jetpacks are a highlight. It also sort of makes sense. I'd certainly want a jetpack if I was fighting somewhere with a risk of falling, and if playing on Legendary, a chieftain will also be on hand to cause more problems. If the earlier turret sequence was more fun on easier difficulties, I'd say here the chieftain's presence makes the encounter a lot more interesting, as you don't have too much space to work with. Also, the backdrop featuring the remains of the space elevator destroyed earlier during Uplift Reserve, very cool. This is the second time you play as Dutch during the campaign, the first being Uplift Reserve where you can see the elevator fall, and it's a great way of adding further environmental consistency to the world across his two levels. After clearing the rooftop of Covenant, a Pelican arrives to collect Dutch and Mickey, at which point ONI Alpha Site ends with a big bang.
Glad you boys are safe and sound. Well, likewise, Gunny. You need a pickup?
As long as you're offering. We're in the police HQ.
Can you take us there?
Affirmative.
All right. See you up top.
What?
This day ain't turning out so bad after all.
Continuing to explore New Mombasa's pitch-black streets, the rookie comes across a damaged sniper rifle as NMPD HQ begins. The mission kicks off with Buck trying to contact Rookie to no avail before Mickey and Dutch arrive on the scene, although they're quickly forced to retreat by a pair of Banshees.
Welcome aboard, ladies. First stop, anywhere but here.
Banshees, on your 6! Hit the deck!
We're losing her! Watch out!
Mickey, Dutch! Status!
And it's worth noting that Romeo fires precisely 3 shots during this scene, which I'll come back to in just a tick. On the story side of things, I want to quickly highlight the in-mission dialogue during this level, as something I think ODST does quite well is balance its more serious side with its humour. Exploring New Mombasa at night as the Rookie tends to be a very serious affair, while the missions which take place during the day tend to be accompanied by dialogue which is a bit brighter, and NMPD HQ is one of those where I enjoy it most.
Thanks for picking such a tall building. I'm really digging all these stairs.
Do you ever get tired of bitching, Romeo?
You ever get tired of busting my balls?
Point taken.
You take control of Romeo with only 1 bullet remaining in his rifle's chamber, a nice bit of continuity following the opening cutscene, during which Romeo fired the 3 shots I mentioned a moment ago, and what follows is classic Halo. Truth and Reconciliation in Combat Evolved started the trend of most games in the series featuring a mission which begins with a sniper rifle, with Three's the arc and reaches Nightfall following suit, and ODST is no exception. The mission's level design is perhaps what makes these opening sections stand out compared to the examples I've just listed, in a good way and in a bad way. Let's get the bad out of the way first. Putting the mission's skybox, which is in fairness one of the best in the series, to one side, NMPD HQ does struggle somewhat in terms of aesthetics. Visually, ODST is not the most varied Halo title ever created, and that is certainly evident here. The environment is fairly generic, with little to differentiate individual sections of the map, other than at its end, and I would have liked there to have been a little more going on to help it stand out from the other city locales featured during the campaign. That being said, what I do find more interesting is how the areas are laid out, which does go some way towards helping it stand apart from the other sniper missions in the series I just mentioned. I've always considered ODST to be a more narrow affair on the whole than other Halo titles, and that's certainly the case with NMPD HQ, in keeping with the theme of being an ODST, who are talented soldiers but certainly no Spartans. Battles during the game generally feel like more exhausting brawls, and so it makes sense that even when giving you a sniper rifle, Bungie ensures that encounters still feel more personal than they perhaps do during similar affairs in other Halo games. It's also worth noting that there are a couple of alternative paths which can be used during these opening sections, but because the combat is very in your face and the environments are extremely narrow to begin with, I'd guess many may not have even noticed that they were an option during the ensuing chaos. After topping up your sniper ammo in a lobby where Covenant and UNSC forces had seemingly been involved in a skirmish, you arrive at the third of the mission's sniper segments. There's a very smooth ramp up in difficulty up to this point, which helps events remain engaging. In the first area, you take on grunts and brutes in a narrow environment. In the second, you face the same again, plus the added threat of jackal snipers in a larger area. And now that you've hopefully sharpened your aim, you take on brutes equipped with jetpacks in what I reckon is the most entertaining of the 3 encounters. The next section might take you by surprise somewhat, as you stumble across a large Covenant squad, and a more exciting piece of music kicks in.
Reinforcements! I stuck him! Target down! They took cover!
NMPD HQ uses ODST's soundtrack really well, and this is perhaps my favourite example other than during its conclusion, which we'll get to shortly. The Covenant being much closer to you when entering the area is one sign that you maybe need to fight from close quarters, but I think what really encourages you to ditch the sniper and close the gap between your enemies is the track used, which kicks into gear at just the right moment to signify a transition in combat styles. Once that encounter's done and dusted, you enter the mission's final segment, which is also its best. I find the idea of Romeo, a sniper, being afraid of heights fairly amusing.
That's the bridge? You gotta be kidding me.
And the next few moments spent crossing the makeshift bridge as Banshees fly overhead, causing it to shudder every time they do so, are some of the most memorable in the entire game. That's something also true of the mission's final standoff as well, as Romeo and Buck reunite with Dutch and Mickey to fight off wave after wave of Covenant reinforcements flanked by Banshees. I think it's fair to say that it's not the most subtle encounter in the series, but it's hard not to be entertained by Proceedings. There's more turrets than you can shake a stick at, just begging to be used, and in my view it's the first time in the entire game where it truly feels like you're part of a larger squad. The sheer amount of turrets and other munitions lying around does strike me as a little strange, but given how exciting the encounter ends up being, I think we can grant Bungie a little artistic license in how the sequence is set up. How the battle is framed is also a clever decision on Bungie's part. You could catch glimpses of the devastation caused to the city as you progress through the mission, but here during the final encounter, they make sure there's little to block your view of the destruction, which you'll be looking at a whole lot as Banshees draw your attention to what's in the distance. I also mentioned how much I enjoy the music during this mission, and my favourite of all its uses also comes during this set piece. Air Traffic Control, which you can hear playing in the background now, is a fantastic track, and its inclusion here really helps elevate the scene as a whole. It's hard not to find yourself at least a little bit exhilarated, as it plays in the background while you fire rocket after rocket at Banshees, Phantoms, and occasionally even Covenant ground troops. My comments regarding the soundtrack also apply to the wider game. Like ODST itself, it's certainly different from other titles, but it also fits perfectly with the mood of the title as a whole, and the occasional jazz numbers which are thrown in really make it stand out from anything else in the series. The end of the battle is marked by the appearance of a brute chieftain, and things don't end too well for Romeo. And even during this scene demonstrating the brute's power, there's still time for some of the ODST's trademark banter at the end.
Get this thing off of me!
There is but one more object left for the rookie to find, a biofoam canister, which marks the end of the open world portion of Halo 3 ODST and the start of its 6th level. Kikowani Station kicks off with Romeo receiving some much needed TLC following his encounter with a brute chieftain during the closing stages of NMPD HQ, with Buck deciding the best course of action is to steal a ride.
Wait here. We're gonna steal that ride. It's landing. Now's our chance! Mickey, you're with me!
This is the game's last flashback and the final level during which you play as anyone other than the rookie, on this occasion Buck for a second time following Tayari Plaza earlier. By the time you reach its end, past has caught up with present and all events after occur simultaneously. The first thing I'm always reminded of when revisiting Kikowani Station is that it's the campaign's best looking environment. Bloom was an extremely prevalent graphical effect which was used gratuitously during gaming's 7th generation to effectively amplify light sources, creating a glow effect. ODST is not a title which managed to escape its bright, visually overpowering clutches, and the same is true of Halo 3 before it, although I find its use less egregious there. Much of the time I find it to be way too much, but here it sort of works. The way light sources cut through the darkness gives New Mombasa's lower levels a gorgeous futuristic aesthetic which is present elsewhere, but to nowhere near the same effect. That beauty does come at a cost, however, with many areas being so dark that use of your visor almost becomes mandatory. It makes total sense in world. The situation you find yourself in is exactly what it's designed for, but I personally prefer to use it as little as possible, especially given it makes the bloom effects even more invasive than they already are. Here, at times though, it can be a struggle to pick out enemies without it. Once the opening area has been cleared, Mickey hops in a nearby Phantom and Buck commandeers a Banshee.
Cabin secure. Flight controls read green across the board. Well, purple. But she's good to go, I think. Okay, I'll grab a Banshee. You go get Dutch and Romeo. On my way!
Let's talk about Halo 3 ODST's Banshee. It is one of the most hilariously overpowered vehicles in the entire series. Why? Well, let's take a quick look at Banshees in other titles' campaigns. Halo Combat Evolved's Banshee is finicky, lacking the boost function and ability to perform aerial maneuvers both introduced in 2, and dropping like a stone when not piloted. It's a tough nut to crack, but mastering it is very rewarding. Halo 2's Banshee is far more user-friendly. Along with the pair of aforementioned new features, when not being piloted, it hangs in the air while still retaining some forward momentum. You can pilot Banshees in Halo 3 and Halo Reach's single-player offerings if you know how, but they're primarily balanced for multiplayer, and so I'm less interested in them in this particular instance. In ODST, the Banshee is an absurd instrument of destruction custom-made to rain down death from above. Not only is it incredibly nimble, it also barely moves forward unless you tell it to, which essentially turns it into a particularly deadly turret, except you also have the option to reposition whenever necessary. Kikowani Station is undoubtedly one of Halo's easiest ordeals on Legendary because of it. It requires the least skill of any Banshee to pilot, and so I'm glad it's a one-off here, but it is a ton of fun to put through its paces during a shorter affair like this one. Using a Banshee for the vast majority of the mission also makes it a novel experience. Some sections featuring it in other Halos are more successful than others, 2's Scarab escort during the Great Journey being my personal favourite, and with Bungie opting not to give us any Banshee sequences at all in 3 or Reach, opting instead to introduce the Hornet and Falcon respectively, the opportunity to get reacquainted with the Covenant's most memorable vehicle is a welcome one. As it begins to look like the area has been cleared of Covenant, enemy Banshees arrive to hassle you, and after they've been shot out the sky, you progress through a narrower area before reaching the next big battle.
Well, look at that. I think we found us a squid house. Give me an angle. I'm gonna burn it to the ground.
The Engineer's recharging stations don't serve much of a purpose beyond being fun to blow up to cause damage to everything around them, but they do give you some extra insight into how an enemy you've not encountered much at all functions. It's also appropriate they explode in such an exaggerated manner. Engineers, after all, use gas bladders in order to float through the air. This area isn't overly exciting compared to the final 2 which follow, but there is some dialogue it's possible to miss, although I'd imagine most won't. If you fly as high as you can go, you'll hear this exchange.
What do you see, Gunny?
A whole lot of Covenant gathering around the crater from that slip space rupture. I wonder what they're looking for.
I bet the captain would know.
Yeah, I bet you're right.
And if you keep your eyes peeled, you might also notice the Covenant's ongoing excavation of the artifact in the background. You do also get a brief glimpse of it during Kikowani Station's closing cinematic and during the game's ending, in case you missed it here. After opening the door to the passage which funnels you forwards, there's another quick narrow area teeming with Covenant who need to be mopped up in order to clear a path into the level's 3rd large area. During ODST's vehicle-centric missions in particular, Bungie utilises a strict structure when it comes to level design I only really noticed recently, and it's Kikowani Station that made it most obvious to me. Each unfolds in a very straightforward manner due to the rigid formula they all follow. Kikowani Station is a series of large areas, with each connected to the next by a short narrow corridor. Earlier during Uplift Reserve the same is true, with large areas connected by short narrow corridors, and the same can be said of Kizingo Boulevard immediately after too. I'm sure you can see the pattern beginning to emerge. Do not conflate my drawing attention to this as being criticism. This miniaturised version of Bungie's famously tight pacing is almost a necessity given how brief ODST's vehicle missions are. That being said, it's a lot easier here to see how the sausage is made, so to speak, compared to the longer affairs in Combat Evolved, 2, 3 and Reach, where Bungie had larger environments to work with and a much bigger budget. As I've said many times before, Halo's constant transitioning between the enclosed and the open are brilliant and have always been a huge part of why I love the series, but I think it's fair to say those shifts are definitely better disguised and more varied in the series' more expansive titles. Bungie does do a consistently good job of scaling up encounters regardless of how templated ODST's levels are, and this one is no exception. Your first Banshee battle consists predominantly of ground troops with a couple of enemy air combatants thrown in at the end. The second has a lot more aerial threats to deal with in addition to the familiar foot soldiers, while the third occurring on screen right now adds Covenant anti-air defences for you to contend with. Then there's a Scarab blocking your escape to round things out in high-octane fashion. I don't usually talk about Easter eggs unless they feature my name, see Regret in Halo 2, but as composer Marty O'Donnell is a semi-frequent visitor to my channel, and because this change annoys me, I feel obliged to mention this one in particular. Flying over to the right side of the area and dropping down on a certain platform while playing on Legendary, you can see 343 Industries former creative director Frank O'Connor doing a spot of sweeping while the track Siege of Madrigal plays. It wasn't always like this. Originally it was Marty having a bit of a dance instead. I'd assume it was changed due to Marty no longer being connected with the franchise, but whatever the reason, it's not the same. There's a final smaller section before Kikowani Station's concluding set piece, one you have to work your way through on foot.
Damn, door's jammed. Must have lost power. I'll head through on foot, see if I can find a workaround inside the tunnel.
An engineer on the backlines, a turret, a gaggle of invisible brutes and a chieftain make the encounter a tricky one, and while there's nothing overly spectacular to chat about here, I like that we get one final playable demonstration of Buck's abilities. No wonder he eventually joined the Spartan program. The final open space contains a mix of Covenant soldiers, Banshees and the like you'll have already seen a few times by this point, and it is of course the Scarab at the back of the area which requires the most attention. Having to dodge its constant attacks while clearing out the area so you can face it without being bothered is an interesting challenge, even if the distance between you and it means it isn't too much of a threat if you remain alert. Looking back at the other occasions Scarabs have been present throughout the series, I'd rank this one somewhere in the middle. It's hard to beat the Scarab double act towards the end of Halo 3's The Covenant, or that in The Storm, with mongooses zipping in between the gigantic beast's feet. Both I consider to be among the greatest set pieces Halo has to offer. I definitely prefer it to the encounter at the end of Metropolis, which has aged poorly compared to later battles, and the one featured in the Ark, which is notable only because you might be taking it on using a Scorpion. I'd argue it's probably the easiest of them all too. As discussed earlier, ODST's Banshee is an absolute monster, with it being incredibly easy to both shoot the Scarab and not be shot by it. Because there's also little room for it to maneuver, it's extremely easy to get behind it and finish the fight quickly, and landing on it and doing the job on foot isn't much harder either. It should also be noted that you're under no obligation to actually destroy the Scarab, and you can simply open the door and completely ignore it, but that's not really in the spirit of things. Once you've either left it in pieces or have rushed right past it, you're given one last opportunity to make a few engineer stations go bang before the team reaches clear skies and Kikowani Station ends. It's not yet time to escape though, with Buck deciding there's still more work to be done.
Look at those tunnels. Ones that aren't flooded are probably packed with buggers. Hell, I wouldn't go down there even if you ordered me to.
Come on, Veronica. What could be more important than that carrier?
My orders. And Buck, call me Captain.
Mickey, turn around. Find a safe place to set us down.
What? Why?
I lost something. Now I know where to find her.
Returning to New Mombasa, the rookie receives a radio message from Dare.
Can anyone hear me? This is Captain Veronica Dare. My beacon is active. Need immediate assistance. Someone, please respond.
With the only remaining option being to head underground to begin Halo 3 ODST's penultimate mission, Data Hive. Upon arrival, he receives a second troubling transmission from Alpha 9's captain.
They've got me cornered. I'm low on ammo. If you can hear me, I'm on sub-level 9. News station.
Before you're free to begin exploring the area, an area which, according to some nearby grunts, should have already been closed off by the drones instead of them devoting their attention to their new hive.
Why Yen Mei not seal this entrance? Too busy building fancy spin house. If traitor escape, it's their fault, not ours.
Data Hive starts out really strong. Something had clearly happened in the centre prior to Rookie arriving, with dead bodies strewn across the first room you explore, and this door opening and closing on the leg of one unfortunate soul. The music playing, the track you can hear now, has an oppressive quality in keeping with the mission's mechanical, claustrophobic layout and aesthetic, and I'd go so far as to say that it almost has a sort of droning quality to it, much like most of the level's soundtrack. That is of course especially fitting given both the environmental context, it's one full to the brim with machinery whirring away, but also because Data Hive is, I think, the most drone heavy level in the entire franchise. Developer Bungie does also throw in some straightforward encounters during these early moments to keep you on your toes, and I'd rather they weren't there. Even with their inclusion, it's still a very lonely and tense beginning to proceedings, but there wouldn't have been any harm in letting things simmer for just a little while longer. I'd have not only kept the first few corridors entirely devoid of Covenant, but I'd have also either done the same to these circular rooms or removed most of them altogether. It would have helped really build tension for events which follow, ensuring their impact was felt all the more acutely. In terms of those events, first you meet this NMPD officer.
Thanks, Trooper. They almost had me. Been trying to get down to the next level checking my team, but this stack is locked down tight.
Welcome. Access granted.
Huh. Guess you have the magic touch.
Which is followed swiftly by a jump scare of sorts.
Buggers! Look out!
Before you drop down into the next area and enter the darkest room you've encountered so far, where you witness a drone feasting on a human corpse. Imagine how much more unsettling this chain of events would have been if there were no encounters prior to them. You'd wander through a number of cold, uninviting environments filled with the bodies of both human and Covenant alike, and soon begin to feel like you were trapped in a horrifying maze of nondescript tunnels. And then, as the stress of anticipation became almost too much to bear, you'd be hit with the 1-2 punch of the drones bursting out in front of you, followed by the macabre scene in the darkened room below. What happens in Data Hive's current guise is still anxiety-inducing nonetheless, but I reckon just a bit more restraint on Bungie's part could have led to an even more harrowing outcome. I also can't talk about Data Hive without mentioning its circular rooms, and indeed the corridors they punctuate, both of which appear far too frequently during its early stages. There are definite shades of Halo Combat Evolved mission Assault on the Control Room, which itself had a real problem with similar environmental repetition. In that mission, there was a long section during which you transitioned between these bridges and these circular rooms without doing much else, and Data Hive is much the same. You spend a lot of time in either these hallways or these smaller areas, regularly moving between the two, and it begins to quickly feel very repetitive. The encounters within them are mixed up. For example, at one point you take on a pack of invisible brutes in the darker hallways, which I always enjoy, and I do like the icy areas towards the mission's midpoint accompanied by a switch to a cooler colour palette, but neither environments nor encounters are mixed up enough that proceedings avoid feeling very unengaging after a while. And that is a particularly impressive feat when you consider that ODST's levels shouldn't really have that problem, considering their truncated runtimes compared to traditional Halo affairs. There's a nice touch with the officer referenced earlier which I want to highlight briefly too. If you've collected 29 out of 30 audio logs prior to beginning Data Hive, he will actually lead you to the conclusion of the storyline featured in them before trying to kill you. And if you haven't, the Superintendent AI will trap him earlier on.
You hear that? Buggers! Down on your level! Oh no! They're up here too! Coming out of the damn vents! Get back! No! Ah!
Crime doesn't pay.
It's not something I'd take into account when talking about the level's quality, but it's an interesting addition and a nice way to conclude that particular plot thread in-game, made all the more unique due to the officer being the only human encountered in the series who will attack you without provocation. Quite the claim to fame, if I do say so myself. Heading into the level's final third, you meet up with Dare, who gives you the rundown on what exactly her mission is.
Some idiots blew the building at the top of the shaft. Woke the whole hive. Down there, that's the superintendent, the AI that runs every system in the city. My mission, our mission, is to secure the superintendent's data. Problem is, there's only one way in from here, right through the hive.
And what follows really puts the Hive into Data Hive. Flanked by Dare, there are one or two more of the same old boring corridors to traverse, but soon enough you reach the Hive itself. This next section I'd guess you're either going to be a fan of or detest with every fibre of your being. In the interest of objectivity, I'm going to try and look at it from both angles, although I must confess that I think it's a great encounter. It's the Halo equivalent of the famous scene in Aliens where the Marines wander into the Hive and are promptly ambushed. In fact, given how many other similarities there are between the two franchises, it wouldn't surprise me if ODST's rendition is directly inspired by James Cameron's action masterpiece. Drones surround you from all directions in the hazy environment, and it can at times be quite overwhelming, in a good way, for me at least. The drone's presence can certainly be oppressive, especially on higher difficulties, but you're given the largest arena thus far to soften the blow, with the encounter becoming much easier once you get into a rhythm of manoeuvring so that most of your enemies are in front of you. On the other hand, I can equally understand how you might find the encounter to be incredibly irritating. For many, the drones are up there with the Flood as one of Halo's most annoying enemies to fight, and if you feel that way, nothing here will change your mind. And when paired with gameplay some will find at best repetitive and at worst completely uninspiring earlier on, the Hive is shown in a particularly bad light. It's another few minutes that feels like a drag in a level which might already feel like, well, a drag. A further encounter with another group of Covenant, including a Brute chieftain with a gravity hammer, acts as a palate cleanser of sorts, before Rookie and Dare make an unusual new friend.
Don't shoot! We've seen them before on other ops, but we've never gotten this close.
A scene which changes ever so slightly if you've collected all the audio logs. Instead of Rookie aiming his gun at the newly discovered engineer, he will whistle for it to come out of hiding instead, with Dare being the one to aim her gun at the creature. You might notice too that Rookie's whistle is the same noise the Superintendent makes, a very clever addition many are likely to miss. Also, and someone may correct me on this, but I'm not sure it makes sense that who points the gun changes depending on the number of audio logs collected. Like earlier with the NMPD officer, the alternate scene is a nice way of rewarding those who have spent time gathering collectibles. However, I do wonder whether they should have shown either Rookie raising his gun or neither Dare nor Rookie raising their weapons for consistency's sake. As you begin to exit the area, you meet up with Buck once again for what is by far Data Hive's best encounter, before Bungie throws in another scary moment. Dropping down this hole, you'll turn and realise you're surrounded by sleeping drones nestled on the ceiling. It's a real horror moment you might have encountered before, certainly in films. This, I think, could have been moved to earlier in the mission. At this point, you're firmly in the action part of Data Hive, and your blood will be well and truly pumping, which dampens its impact somewhat as you're not really on edge to begin with. Stick this in during the level's early stages when you first meet the drones instead, and I think it would be a lot more memorable. Where it is, it's not far off feeling like a continuation of the encounter you've just fought through, and it definitely loses some of its shock value as a result. To lighten the mood, there is some entertaining dialogue not long after between Dare and Buck.
I've seen hundreds of these things today. Why is this one so important?
This engineer knows what the Covenant's after. If I could safely capture more of them, I would. What they know could win the war.
Oh.
You haven't killed any of them, have you?
No! Well, maybe one or two.
Nice work.
How was I supposed to know?
But little else of value before Data Hive concludes. I would have liked to have seen the Hive, or the astounding number of drones present, play a larger part in these last few areas if I'm being honest. They could have possibly had a similar mechanic to the penthouse you visit during New Alexandria in Halo Reach, except where in that section you had to run from a seemingly endless swarm. Perhaps on this occasion it would be about protecting Virgil from them, or maybe more would spawn the slower you progressed, acting as a very lethal timer of sorts, pushing you towards the finish line. Although, given the level ends quite abruptly, I don't suppose it matters too much either way. Coastal Highway follows immediately, with Buck and Dare sharing a tender moment.
Oh, Lord, that thing stinks. Kind of reminds me of my... What was that for?
Abandoning the mission.
What mission? You dropped off the grid. My squad was scattered. And that?
For coming back.
And this side of ODST's plot is something surprisingly unique to the Halo series story. I may have forgotten an example or two, and I apologise if so, but as far as I can remember, across 8 mainline titles, there's barely any romance whatsoever. Master Chief and Cortana's relationship I do wholeheartedly believe was romantic in nature, and no one will ever be able to convince me otherwise, but in terms of explicit relationships, there are very few. It's a side of Halo I'd be open to seeing much more of in the future. Bringing you back to the streets of New Mombasa one last time before the game concluded is a welcome decision by Bungie. You spend a lot of time exploring them during ODST, but won't have done for a good few missions by this point due to the game's increased linearity during its latter stages, and returning to them for a few final firefights is rather enjoyable. It also serves to drive home how short a period the events of the game take place over. Rookie wakes up and begins searching the streets in the dead of night, and while you do play through flashbacks which occurred during the daytime, what takes place in the present happens primarily under the cover of darkness. But here, during ODST's final moments, you're in the present and it's light outside, the gloomy uncertainty of the start of the game replaced perhaps by a few rays of hope. The early encounters on the streets are fairly standard affairs and you should get through them fairly quickly, after which you'll wait for the engineer to power up an elevator before a cutscene kicks in.
I stole a Phantom, yes, thank you. I hid it in the shipyards down the highway. But I only have room for 2, so that thing's gonna have to sit on your lap.
The engineer. Where did it go?
What follows is probably my favourite sequence in the entire game, as you race down the highway with Buck while trying to keep the engineer and Dare out of harm's way. During this video's introduction, I mentioned that ODST was afforded less resources than most other Halo titles, and that it's therefore limited in terms of scope and scale when compared to its far larger, far more expensive siblings. With that being the case, I think the inclusion of the highway sequence was a really clever idea. For one thing, its layout must have made encounter design a far simpler process. Rather than having to create multiple varied arenas within which combat took place, everything happens within very similar surroundings right through to the end of the section. That's not to say that the encounters featured within aren't still interesting, but it certainly will have also made things easier to design. Bungie's ability to ramp up difficulties smoothly over time is definitely still on full display here regardless, as you first take on mostly grunts, then more mixed groups of enemies, and finally ghosts and banshees. Then you get your hands on a Scorpion as events continue to rapidly escalate. As you get closer and closer to the city, encounters become more and more explosive, which of course makes a lot of sense. The introduction of the highway is also a brilliant idea, as it allowed Bungie to precisely frame the action and events that you're not directly involved in. Whether that's the incredible number of banshees passing overhead, the Scarab clambering across buildings in the distance, or the Covenant ship glassing the city as you draw near, there's pretty much always something interesting happening in the background as you battle your way towards New Mombasa. Think of it as being very much like a ghost train, except far more awesome. You're following a very strict path, which especially in the case of a road dictates where you'll be looking, and so Bungie was able to dedicate all of its resources to what's happening primarily in one direction, rather than having to worry too much about you looking at the wrong thing and missing something amazing. Even the dialogue during this part is handled expertly. A particularly good example is Buck's shift in tone. At first, he's his usual laid-back self, even with the chaos surrounding him.
Hey, Captain? Pick a lane.
A little crowded in here. The engineer's doing something with the control circuits. Hey, what do you put that?
Gotta be kidding me.
I'm doing the best I can. Just stay out of our way.
But as events intensify, he becomes notably concerned.
No! They're gonna burn this city and then collapse the whole planet! Covenant bastards! It's just like Reach all over again!
We made it out of there. We make it out of here. Do this, Buck.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Early Earlier, I said this sequence is probably my favourite in the entire game, but honestly, that perhaps doesn't do it justice. I'd actually go so far as to say that for me, it's one of the standout parts of the entire Halo series. After leaving the highway, there's still one last encounter to fight through as the group await the arrival of Mickey and co.
Mickey, what's your ETA?
Had to reroute, Gunny. The whole damn city's on fire.
Trooper, I have a Tier 1 asset and a whole bunch of Covenant that want it dead. Whatever you're gonna do, step on it.
Yes, ma'am.
Much like the encounters which opened Coastal Highway, this one is nothing you won't have seen before, but it's nevertheless quite entertaining. There's little room to manoeuvre, which means you basically have no choice but to face the Covenant head on, although the odds are evened out somewhat by the fairly robust selection of weapons on offer to you. Like the highway, you again face waves of enemies increasing in difficulty over time, except on this occasion you're on foot, with the crescendo coming in the form of a brute chieftain. And once he's been taken out, it's time for Brookie and team to leave the city as Halo 3 ODST draws to a close.
What can I say? It was a hell of a night.
Before I round this one out, as always, a massive thank you to those of you who have made it all the way to the end. As mentioned many moons ago at the start of this video, Halo 3 ODST might not be the most expansive of Bungie's titles, but it has a lot of heart and remains a fantastic part of the series. If you enjoyed yourself and are looking for more like this, I've completed similar videos covering every Bungie developed Halo, which I've compiled into a playlist you can reach by clicking the card on screen now. And with that, thanks again for watching the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you had a Halo-tastic time, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts, and hopefully we'll hang out again soon.